The healer screamed and pulled her hand back, blood welling from 3 thin cuts across her fingers. She stumbled out of the room without looking back, and the door slammed shut behind her on its own, as if the house itself wanted to keep the truth locked inside. In the corner of that dim room, a small silver and black cub pressed himself against the wall, chest heaving, eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the woman he had just bitten. He was not trying to hurt her. He was trying to survive a world that had already taken the only thing he trusted. 4 months. That was how long it had been since the cub had last let anyone touch him. 4 months since the attack that took his mother from him. And 4 months since he had shifted back into the small human boy he used to be. The pack healers whispered that his mind was broken beyond repair. Some said his body had forgotten how to be a boy at all, that grief had locked him inside his wolf skin the way a key locks inside a rusted door. Nobody could explain it. Nobody could fix it. Ronan Ashwood stood outside that door with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, listening to the healer's footsteps fade down the hallway. He was the Alpha King of one of the strongest packs in the Northern Territories, a man who had commanded warriors through 3 border wars and had never once let his enemies see him afraid. But standing outside his son's door, he felt something close to helplessness, an emotion so foreign to him that it left a bitter taste at the back of his throat. He pushed the door open slowly, the way he always did now, careful not to make a sound that might startle the boy inside. The room smelled of old herbs and untouched food. A tray sat by the door, the same tray that had been left there that morning, its contents cold and barely touched. In the far corner, half hidden behind an overturned chair, the cub watched him with eyes that were the same amber color as his late wife's had been. It was the only piece of her the boy had left, and some days it was almost too painful for Ronan to look at. "It's just me," Ronan said quietly, lowering himself to sit on the floor near the doorway, far enough that the cub would not feel trapped. "You don't have to come closer. I just want to see you." The cub's ears flattened against his skull. A low sound rumbled in his throat, not quite a growl, more like a warning wrapped around a plea. "Stay away. Please stay away." Ronan had heard that sound every single day for 4 months, and every single day it broke something inside him a little further. He thought about the day it happened more often than he wanted to admit. The attack had come at dusk, when the borders were supposed to be safest, when the patrols had just changed and the pack had let its guard down for exactly the wrong few minutes. Rival wolves, wearing no colors that anyone recognized, had slipped through the eastern woods and struck the royal den itself. Ronan had been in a council meeting 3 buildings away when the alarm horn sounded. By the time he reached the den, his mate lay in the grass, and his son, barely 7 years old, was crouched over her body in his small wolf form, snarling at anything that came near, unable to protect her and unwilling to leave her. The boy had not spoken a single human word since. He had not shifted back even once. The healers said his body was healthy, that there was no physical reason he could not change forms, which meant the block was somewhere deeper, somewhere none of their medicine could reach. Grief could do strange things to a young wolf's mind, they told him. Some cubs regressed when they lost a parent too suddenly. Some simply refused to come back. Ronan stayed sitting on the floor for nearly an hour that evening, saying nothing more, simply being present in the room the way he did every night, hoping that his presence alone might eventually mean something. When he finally rose to leave, the cub had not moved from his corner, had not touched the fresh tray of food Ronan set down, had not made a single sound except that same low warning rumble. Ronan closed the door gently behind him and stood in the hallway for a long moment, pressing the heel of his hand against his closed eyes. Owen, his second in command and closest friend since childhood, was waiting a few steps away, arms folded, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man who had delivered too much bad news lately and dreaded delivering more. "Any change?" Owen asked, though his tone already knew the answer. "None." Ronan's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a king rather than a father. The healer left with cuts on her hand. She won't be the last one to give up. "The council is asking questions again," Owen said carefully. "Some of them think it's time to consider other options. There are packs to the south with wolves trained in deep mind healing. It would mean sending him away for a season, maybe longer, but no." The word came out sharper than Ronan intended, and he saw Owen flinch slightly at the force of it. He softened his tone, though the refusal did not waver. "He has already lost his mother. I will not have him lose his home as well. Not while there is still a chance he can heal here. And if there is no chance? Ronan did not answer. He simply walked past his friend and down the corridor, his footsteps echoing off stone walls that had once carried the sound of his son's laughter, back when the boy still remembered how to laugh, back before 4 months of silence had swallowed every trace of the child he used to be. That night, long after the pack house had gone quiet, Ronan returned to the door one final time, the way he did every night without fail. He did not go inside. He simply stood there, listening, and heard the faint sound of small paws pacing across the floor, back and forth, a restless rhythm that never seemed to stop. Somewhere behind that door, his son was awake and afraid, and there was nothing Ronan could do to reach him. He thought about his wife often in these quiet hours, about the way she used to hum softly while she worked, about how their son had inherited her patience and her gentle way with the younger pack members before everything changed. He thought about promises he had made to her in the early years of their bond, promises about keeping their family safe, about building something that would outlast them both. He had failed one of those promises already. He refused to fail the other. The following morning brought a council meeting that stretched far longer than Ronan had patience for. Border reports came first, routine and unremarkable, followed by discussions of trade routes and the upcoming harvest festival that the pack would need to prepare for, regardless of the sorrow hanging over the royal den. Ronan sat through it all with the practiced stillness of a leader who had learned long ago never to let his people see him distracted, though his mind kept drifting back down the hallway to that closed door. It was Grace, one of the older council members, who finally raised the subject everyone had been avoiding. She was a stern woman, sharp-featured and sharper-tongued, known throughout the pack for saying exactly what others were too polite to say aloud. "My king," she began, folding her hands in front of her. "Forgive me for speaking plainly, but the healers have exhausted what they know. 3 have tried, and 3 have failed. The boy grows thinner. If we continue waiting for a miracle, we may lose him the way we lost his mother, simply through inaction, dressed up as patience." The room went silent. Ronan felt the weight of every eye turning toward him, waiting for his response, waiting to see whether the Alpha King would crack under the pressure of a problem that could not be solved with strength or strategy. "What would you have me do?" Ronan asked, his voice low and controlled. "Force him? Drag him from that room and demand he shift, demand he speak, as though grief were something that could be commanded away? I have seen what fear does to a wolf who is pushed too hard, too fast. I will not do that to my own son." "Then what is your plan?" Grace pressed, not unkindly, but firmly, the way a mother might press a stubborn child, "Because right now, my king, it looks very much like you have none." Ronan had no answer for her, not one he was willing to say aloud. The truth was that he had exhausted every idea he possessed. He had brought in healers from 3 neighboring territories. He had tried herbs, chants, quiet vigils, even the old bonding rituals meant for infant cubs who struggled to shift for the first time. Nothing had worked. Nothing had even come close. The meeting ended without resolution, as most meetings about his son had ended these past 4 months. Ronan walked the long way back to the den afterward, taking the path through the training grounds instead of the main corridor, needing the open air and the sight of his warriors sparring to remind himself that the world outside that closed door still moved forward, even when everything inside it felt frozen in place. He paused at the edge of the grounds, watching a group of young pack members practicing their forms under Lucas's supervision. Lucas caught his eye and gave a respectful nod, then returned his attention to correcting a boy's footwork. It was such an ordinary scene, so far removed from the quiet grief that lived inside the royal den, that Ronan found himself standing there longer than he meant to, simply absorbing the normalcy of it. That was when Owen approached again, this time with a folded report in his hand and an expression that suggested he was bringing news rather than more questions. "There's a woman at the eastern border," Owen said, "human, unarmed, traveling alone. The patrol found her an hour ago near the old mill road. She claims to be seeking shelter, nothing more." Ronan frowned. Humans rarely wandered this deep into pack territory, and those who did usually had reasons that were either desperate or dangerous. What does the patrol think? They think she's telling the truth. She's exhausted, half-starved, and carrying almost nothing. But there's something else. Owen hesitated, choosing his words carefully. She calmed one of the young pups on the way in. A newborn that's been colicky for days, screaming through every feeding. The nursing mothers have tried everything. This woman held him for less than a minute, and he went quiet. Ronan's frown deepened, though something in his chest shifted at the words, some small, cautious flicker of an idea he was not yet ready to name. "Bring her to the main hall," he said finally. "I want to see her myself." Owen nodded and turned to go, but Ronan called after him, before he had taken more than a few steps. "And Owen, say nothing of my son, not yet." Owen paused, glancing back with an expression that suggested he already understood exactly what his king was thinking, even before Ronan had fully admitted it to himself. "Understood, my king." Ronan stood alone at the edge of the training grounds a while longer, watching the sparring continue, letting the small flicker of hope settle in his chest without allowing himself to trust it completely. Hope had disappointed him too many times these past 4 months to be welcomed without caution. But as he turned to walk back toward the main hall, toward the stranger who had somehow calmed a screaming infant with nothing but her presence, he found he could not quite silence the quiet voice inside him that whispered, perhaps, just perhaps, this time would be different. Behind him, far across the grounds, in a small dark room that smelled of untouched food and old herbs, a cub with amber eyes curled tighter into his corner, unaware that somewhere on the eastern edge of his father's territory, a stranger had just taken her first step toward him, without even knowing he existed. Elena Hartley had been walking for 3 days when the wolves found her. She had not meant to cross into anyone's territory. She had simply been moving away from a life that no longer fit her, following back roads and forest trails with no destination in mind, only the instinct to keep going, until the ache in her chest grew quiet enough to bear. She had left behind a town that held too many memories she could not outrun, a family that had grown distant in ways too complicated to explain, and a version of herself she no longer recognized in mirrors. All she carried now was a worn bag, a water flask, and a strange, quiet gift she had never fully understood. Animals had always trusted her, even as a child. Stray dogs that snapped at everyone else would sit calmly at her feet. Wounded birds that fought against every other hand would go still in hers. She had never known why, and she had long ago stopped trying to explain it to people who looked at her strangely when she mentioned it. It was simply a part of her, quiet and constant, the one thing about herself she had never doubted, even when everything else had fallen apart. When the patrol emerged from the tree line, moving with a coordinated silence that told her immediately these were no ordinary men, Elena did not run. She had heard stories about the northern territories, about packs that guarded their land fiercely, and did not welcome outsiders easily. Running would only confirm whatever suspicion already sat behind their eyes. So she stood still, raised her empty hands slightly, and waited. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I didn't know this was someone's land. I'll leave, if that's what you want." The man who stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered with a scar along his jaw, studied her for a long moment before speaking. "That's not your decision to make anymore," he said, not unkindly. "You're coming with us." She did not resist, as they escorted her deeper into the territory, though her mind raced with every possible outcome, none of them particularly comforting. It was only when they passed a small clearing near the edge of a settlement, where several women sat with fussing infants, that her instincts pulled her attention away from her own fear. One of the babies was crying with a raw, exhausted sound, the kind of crying that came from a small body that had been in distress for far too long. The mother looked pale and desperate, rocking him uselessly, while an older woman hovered nearby, offering suggestions that clearly were not helping. Without thinking, without asking permission, Elena stepped toward them. "May I?" she asked softly, and something in her tone made the mother pause and, after a heartbeat of hesitation, hand the baby over. Elena settled the infant against her shoulder, humming low and tuneless, the same instinctive sound she had used on frightened animals her whole life. The baby's cries hitched, faltered, and within a minute dissolved into small hiccuping breaths, before falling silent entirely, his tiny fists uncurling against her collarbone. The mother stared at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. "How did you—" she began, but the guard who had escorted Elena was already stepping forward, his expression unreadable, clearly deciding this small miracle was worth reporting. They brought her the rest of the way to the main hall in a kind of careful silence, as though nobody quite knew what to make of her anymore. The hall itself was larger and more imposing than anything Elena had seen in her travels, stone walls rising high overhead, banners bearing an unfamiliar crest hanging along the sides. She felt impossibly small standing in the middle of it, aware of every eye that turned to watch her enter. The man who sat waiting for her at the far end of the hall carried himself with an authority that needed no announcement. He was broad-shouldered like the guards who had escorted her, but there was something heavier in his posture, something that spoke of exhaustion, carried for far too long beneath a calm exterior. His eyes, when they met hers, were sharp and assessing, though not unkind. "You calmed my patrol's report of a screaming infant," he said without preamble, "and I'm told you did it without effort, as though it were the simplest thing in the world." "I don't know how to explain it," Elena admitted. "Animals and children have always been easier for me than people. I don't do anything special. I just sit with them, and somehow they settle." "And people?" His question was sharper than she expected. "Do they settle for you as well?" Elena hesitated. "Sometimes, not always. People are more complicated than a crying baby or a frightened dog." Something flickered across his expression, quick and unreadable, gone before she could name it. He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the urge to fill the silence, though she resisted it, sensing instinctively that this man valued patience over nervous chatter. "My name is Ronan Ashwood," he said finally. "I lead this pack. You've wandered further into my territory than most humans ever do, whether by accident or otherwise. I would normally have you escorted back to the nearest human town within the hour." Elena's stomach dropped slightly, though she kept her expression steady. But, Ronan continued, rising slowly from his seat, "I find myself in need of something that has nothing to do with borders or politics, and I am wondering, Elena Hartley, whether the gift that calmed a crying infant in less than a minute might be capable of something far more difficult." He did not explain further that first evening. He simply offered her a room in the guest quarters, food, and the promise of a conversation the following morning that would determine whether she stayed or left. Elena lay awake long into the night, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, wondering what kind of difficult thing a king like that could possibly need from a woman with nothing to offer but a strange, quiet way with frightened creatures. She did not yet know that somewhere in that same stone building, behind a door that had not opened willingly in 4 months, a small silver and black cub lay curled in a dark corner, waiting for a kindness he could not yet imagine was coming. The morning came too quickly, sunlight slipping through unfamiliar curtains and pulling Elena from a shallow, uneasy sleep. She washed her face in the basin left for her, dressed in the same travel-worn clothes she had arrived in, and tried to steady her nerves before the knock came at her door. When it did, it was Owen who stood waiting, his expression polite but unreadable, the same man who had first noticed her calming the crying infant the day before. "The king is ready for you," he said simply, and led her through corridors that felt even larger in daylight, stone walls carved with old symbols she did not recognize, portraits of stern-faced men and women watching her pass with painted eyes. Ronan waited for her in a smaller room this time, not the imposing hall from the night before, but something closer to a private study, shelves lined with old books and maps, a fire burning low in the hearth despite the mild morning. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. "I imagine you spent last night wondering what I could possibly want from you," Ronan said, settling into the chair across from her. "The thought crossed my mind once or twice," Elena admitted, and something almost like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, before vanishing again. "I have a son," he said, and immediately the weight in his voice shifted, grew heavier, more careful. 7 years old. 4 months ago, his mother was killed in an attack on our territory. He was there when it happened. Since that day, he has not shifted back into his human form. He does not speak. He does not eat unless food is left where he can reach it without anyone watching. He does not let anyone near him, not healers, not pack members he has known his entire life, not even me. Elena's chest tightened at the plainness of his words, the way grief could be spoken so simply and still carry such enormous weight. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, and meant it. "I am not telling you this for sympathy," Ronan continued, though his tone had softened slightly at her response. "I am telling you because I have run out of options within my own pack. Every healer we have tried has failed, some of them injured for their efforts. My counsel believes I should send him away to be treated elsewhere, somewhere far from everything and everyone he has ever known. I refuse to do that unless I have exhausted every possibility here first. And you think I might be one of those possibilities? Elena said slowly, beginning to understand. I think, Ronan said, choosing his words with visible care, that whatever allows you to calm a screaming infant with nothing but your presence might be worth trying on a boy who has stopped trusting every living thing around him. I am not asking you to heal him. I do not believe healing is something that can be forced or guaranteed. I am asking you to try, with no expectations beyond that, and in exchange I will provide you shelter, protection, and anything else you might need for as long as you wish to stay. Elena sat with the offer for a long moment, turning it over in her mind. She thought about the countless wounded strays she had sat with over the years, the ones who flinched at every movement, the ones who took weeks to trust even a single outstretched hand. She thought about how none of them had ever needed her to succeed, only to be patient, only to stay. She was not certain she could help a grieving child the way she had once helped injured animals, but she found, sitting there in that quiet study, with the fire crackling low beside her, that she could not bring herself to say no either. I'll try, she said finally. I can't promise you anything. I don't know if what works on frightened animals will work on a grieving boy, but I won't refuse to try. Something in Ronan's shoulders eased, just slightly, the smallest release of tension in a man who clearly carried far too much of it. That is more than anyone else has offered me in weeks, he said. Thank you. He rose then, and gestured for her to follow, leading her back through the winding corridors, toward a part of the building she had not yet seen, a quieter wing, where the air itself seemed to grow heavier the further they walked. Pack members they passed along the way offered curious glances, some suspicious, some simply tired, all of them clearly aware of where their king was leading this unfamiliar human woman. They stopped outside a plain wooden door at the end of a narrow hallway. Ronan paused there, his hand resting against the frame, and for a moment, Elena saw something in his expression that had nothing to do with authority or leadership, something rawer and more exposed. The simple fear of a father who had already lost too much. He bit the last healer who tried, Ronan said quietly. Drew blood. I tell you this not to frighten you away, but because I want you to understand what you are walking into. He is not cruel. He is afraid, and fear makes creatures do things they would never otherwise do. I understand fear, Elena said simply. I won't force anything. I won't even try to touch him today. I just want to see him, if that's all right. Ronan studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and pushed the door open, just enough for her to slip through, before stepping back himself, choosing to wait in the hallway rather than enter with her. Elena understood without being told that her presence alone, without a king looming behind her, would matter. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the daylight, the air thick with the smell of untouched food, and something else beneath it. Something like sorrow given physical form. It took her eyes a moment to adjust, and when they did, she saw him. He was smaller than she expected, curled in the farthest corner behind an overturned chair, his silver and black fur matted and dull in a way that spoke of weeks without proper care. His amber eyes locked onto her the moment she entered, wide and wary, his small body going rigid, every muscle coiled and ready to defend himself against a threat that had not yet materialized. Elena did not move toward him. She simply closed the door softly behind her, lowered herself to sit on the floor near the entrance, as far from his corner as the room allowed, and folded her hands quietly in her lap. She said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch, letting him watch her without the pressure of words demanding a response he was not ready to give. Minutes passed. The cub's rigid posture did not fully relax, but the low warning rumble she half expected never came either. He simply watched her, unmoving, his amber eyes tracking every small breath she took, every shift of her weight against the floor. You don't have to do anything, Elena said finally, her voice soft and even, the same tone she had used countless times before with frightened strays, who had learned the world was not safe. I'm not going to come closer. I'm not going to touch you. I just thought I'd sit here for a while, if that's all right with you. He did not respond, of course. Could not respond in any way she would immediately understand, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a fraction of tension easing from his shoulders, though his eyes never left her. Elena continued speaking quietly. telling him about nothing in particular. The weather outside, the long walk that had brought her to this territory. A story about a stray dog she had once nursed back to health, that had taken nearly 2 months before it allowed her to touch its paw. She spoke the way she might speak to any wounded creature too afraid to understand her words, but perhaps able to understand the steadiness in her voice. An hour passed this way, Elena sitting quietly near the door, the cub watching from his corner, neither of them moving closer, neither of them retreating further. When she finally rose to leave, careful to move slowly, unthreateningly, she paused at the door and looked back at him one last time. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "You don't have to do anything different. I just wanted you to know I'll be here." She stepped out into the hallway, where Ronan waited exactly where she had left him, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see the questions burning behind his eyes. "He didn't growl at me," Elena said before he could ask. "That's not nothing, but it's not much either. This will take time, if it works at all. I can't promise you it will." "I understand," Ronan said, and something in the way he said it told her he had understood far more than most people would have, that patience had become both a burden and a discipline he had learned to carry these past 4 months. "Time is something I can give you. Everything else, I am less certain of." They walked back through the corridors together, in a silence that felt different from the wary silence of the day before, something quieter and more contemplative settling between them. Elena found herself glancing sideways at him once or twice, noting the exhaustion carved into his features, the weight he carried so carefully that most would never guess how heavy it truly was. That evening, as she sat alone in the guest quarters, picking at a meal she had little appetite for, Elena found her thoughts returning again and again to the small cub curled in his dark corner, to the wariness in his amber eyes that reminded her so strongly of every frightened creature she had ever tried to help. She did not know yet whether she could reach him. She did not know whether 4 months of grief and fear could be undone by quiet patience and a stranger's steady presence. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was not going to stop trying, not after seeing the way his eyes had followed her, not after recognizing in him the same desperate need to be seen without being forced, that she herself had carried for longer than she cared to admit. Somewhere down the hall from her quarters, Ronan Ashwood stood once more outside his son's door, listening to the familiar restless pacing within, and allowed himself, for the first time in 4 months, the smallest and most cautious flicker of hope. 7 days passed, and Elena returned to that dim room, every single one of them, never missing a visit, never arriving with expectations, never pushing beyond what the cub seemed ready to allow. Each morning, she sat in the same spot near the door, spoke in the same soft, even voice, and each morning, she noticed something small shift, some tiny fraction of distance closing between them that the day before had seemed impossible. On the 3rd day, he had stopped retreating fully into the shadows behind the overturned chair, choosing instead to lie in the open corner where she could see him clearly, his amber eyes following her every movement with an intensity that had softened, ever so slightly, from wariness into something closer to curiosity. On the 5th day, he had eaten from the fresh tray she brought while she was still in the room, rather than waiting until she left, a small act that made her chest tighten with quiet, cautious hope. Ronan asked about her progress every evening without fail, always in the same careful tone, a man bracing himself equally for good news and bad. Elena had learned quickly that honesty mattered more to him than comfort, that he would rather hear a difficult truth than a gentle lie meant to spare his feelings, so she told him plainly each time, describing every small shift in behavior, every subtle change in the cub's posture, careful never to promise more than she could deliver. "He watched me eat lunch yesterday," she told him one evening, the two of them sitting in the same study where their first conversation had taken place, a fire crackling low in the hearth. Not with fear, with something closer to interest, I think. "I offered him a piece of bread, and he didn't take it from my hand, but he did take it after I set it down and stepped back. That's more progress than 3 healers managed in as many months," Ronan said, something in his voice caught between disbelief and gratitude. "It's small," Elena reminded him gently. "It's not healing, it's just trust, and trust with animals is built one small moment at a time. I don't know if it will be different with him, given that he's not truly an animal, not in the way the strays I've helped before were. But so far, The same patience seems to be working. Ronan studied her across the fire's glow, his expression thoughtful in a way that made Elena feel unexpectedly seen, as though he were considering not just her methods but her as a person, someone separate from the task he had assigned her. "You speak of him as though he still deserves patience," he said quietly. "Most people who have met him these past months speak as though he is something broken, something to be fixed or given up on. You never have." "He's not broken," Elena said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "He's grieving in the only way his body knows how to grieve. That's not the same thing at all." Something shifted in Ronan's expression then, something she could not quite name, gone as quickly as it appeared, though it left behind a warmth in the room that had nothing to do with the fire. He did not say anything further that evening, simply thanked her again before she retired to her quarters. But Elena found herself thinking about that look more than she expected to, as she lay awake that night, staring at the same unfamiliar ceiling that had greeted her every night since her arrival. The following morning brought a change she had not anticipated. She arrived at the small room to find the cub already awake and waiting near the center of the space, rather than tucked away in his usual corner. He watched her enter with the same careful attention as always, but something in his posture seemed different, less guarded, as though some invisible wall had shifted overnight. "Good morning," Elena said softly, settling into her usual spot near the door, careful not to comment on the change directly, not wanting to draw too much attention to progress that felt fragile enough to shatter under too much scrutiny. She spent that visit telling him about her childhood, about a small farm she had grown up near, where injured animals seemed to find their way to her without explanation, about a fox with a broken leg that had taken 3 weeks to trust her enough to let her set a splint, about the quiet satisfaction of watching a wounded creature finally believe that not every hand reaching toward it meant harm. The cub listened, or seemed to listen, his ears occasionally flicking toward her voice, his eyes never fully leaving her face. Near the end of the visit, something happened that made Elena's breath catch quietly in her throat. The cub, who had spent nearly 2 weeks maintaining a careful, unbreakable distance between them, took a single small step closer. Just one. He froze immediately afterward, as though startled by his own action, watching her reaction with wide, uncertain eyes, ready to retreat at the first sign of anything that might frighten him. Elena did not move. She did not reach for him, did not speak, did not even shift her weight, understanding instinctively that any sudden motion now could undo weeks of careful, patient progress in a single moment. She simply held his gaze, her expression calm and open, and after a long, tense pause, the cub settled back onto his haunches, still closer than he had ever willingly been before, and did not retreat any further. "That's all right," Elena said softly. Once enough time had passed that she felt certain the moment had settled rather than shattered. "You don't have to come any closer than that. This is already more than enough." When she reported the small step to Ronan that evening, she watched something in his face crack open in a way she had not seen before, a flicker of raw, unguarded emotion breaking through the careful composure he wore like armor. He said nothing for a long moment, simply pressed the heel of his hand against his closed eyes, the way he so often did in private, and when he finally lowered his hand, his eyes were suspiciously bright. 4 months, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. 4 months, and not one healer managed what you have in a single week. "It's not finished," Elena reminded him gently, though she could not fully suppress the small, hopeful warmth spreading through her own chest. "One step doesn't undo 4 months of grief. There will be setbacks. There will be days where he retreats further than he has before. I don't want you to expect more than what this actually is." "I understand," Ronan said, and this time when he looked at her, there was something new in his expression, something that went beyond simple gratitude, though neither of them named it aloud that evening. "I am simply allowing myself, for the first time in a long while, to believe that this ends somewhere other than the grief we have been living inside." The days that followed brought more small steps, each one earned slowly, patiently, without force. The cub began approaching her unprompted at the start of each visit, rather than waiting for her to settle first. He allowed her to sit closer, though he still maintained a careful distance whenever she shifted position too quickly. He began, on occasion, making small sounds that were not quite growls and not quite anything else Elena could easily categorize. Soft, uncertain sounds that felt, to her, like the first fragile attempts at communication after months of complete silence. Then came the night that changed everything. Elena had not planned to be at the pack house so late, but a conversation with one of the healers about herbal remedies for the cub's matted fur had run longer than expected, and by the time she finished, the halls had gone quiet with the deep stillness of late night. She was walking back toward her quarters when a sound stopped her in the corridor, faint and distressed, coming from behind the familiar wooden door at the end of the narrow hallway. She paused, listening. It came again, a soft, pained whimper, the unmistakable sound of a nightmare gripping a small, frightened creature too deep in sleep to escape it on his own. Without fully deciding to, Elena found herself moving toward the door, opening it slowly, quietly, the way she always did. The room was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight slipping through a gap in the curtains. The cub lay curled in the center of the floor, rather than his usual corner, his small body trembling, another whimper escaping him, as his legs twitched against whatever memory held him captive in sleep. Elena's chest ached at the sight of it, and she lowered herself carefully to the floor nearby, closer than she had ever sat before, though still not close enough to touch him. "It's all right," she murmured softly, her voice barely above a whisper, not wanting to startle him awake too abruptly. "You're safe. Whatever it is, it's not real anymore. You're safe." She was not certain whether it was her voice that reached him, or simply the natural end of whatever nightmare gripped him, but slowly, gradually, his trembling eased, his whimpers fading into quiet, uneven breaths. His eyes fluttered open, hazy with sleep and the lingering fear of whatever he had just escaped. And for a long, suspended moment, he simply stared at her, disoriented, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him before. And then, before Elena could fully process what was happening, he moved. Slowly, hesitantly, he crept forward across the small remaining distance between them, and pressed his small body against her side, seeking the comfort and warmth that 4 months of grief had convinced him did not exist anymore. Elena went completely still, her heart pounding in her chest, every instinct she had honed over years of working with frightened creatures screaming at her to remain exactly as she was, to make no sudden movements, to let this fragile, precious moment unfold entirely on his terms. She did not reach down to pet him, did not shift her weight, did not even allow herself to exhale too sharply. She simply sat there, letting him rest against her, his small heartbeat gradually slowing to match the calm, steady rhythm she offered him. It was the first time in 4 months that the boy had willingly touched another living being. Tears blurred Elena's vision before she fully realized they had gathered there, and she blinked them back carefully, not wanting even the small motion of wiping her eyes to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the room. She stayed there long after his breathing evened into the deep, steady rhythm of true sleep, long after her own legs had gone stiff from remaining motionless on the hard floor, simply watching him rest against her, amazed and humbled by the trust he had finally, fully offered her. She did not know how long she remained there before the door creaked softly open behind her, and she turned her head just enough to see Ronan standing in the doorway, having come, as he always did, for his final check of the night. What she saw on his face in that moment, the raw, unguarded shock and disbelief and overwhelming relief, all crashing together at once, was something she would remember for a very long time afterward. He did not speak. He simply stood there in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, as though he needed it to remain standing, staring at the sight of his son sleeping peacefully against a stranger's side for the first time in 4 long, grief-soaked months. Ronan did not move from the doorway for a long time. He simply stood there, watching, memorizing the sight in front of him, as though afraid it might vanish the moment he looked away. His son, curled peacefully against a woman he had known for barely 2 weeks, breathing slow, and even in a way Ronan had not witnessed since before the attack that took everything else from them both. Elena caught his eye and offered the smallest, most careful smile, a silent reassurance that she understood exactly what this moment meant and had no intention of disturbing it. Ronan lowered himself quietly into the doorway, sitting rather than standing, needing suddenly to be closer to the ground, closer to the two of them, though he was careful not to move any further into the room, unwilling to risk breaking whatever fragile spell had settled over his sleeping son. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, the 3 of them arranged in careful stillness, until the cub's sleep grew deep enough that Elena judged it safe to shift her position slightly, easing the ache building in her stiff limbs. He stirred but did not wake, simply resettled against the floor beside her, rather than directly against her side, and Elena finally rose, moving with the same slow carefulness she used for every interaction in that room, and stepped quietly into the hallway to join Ronan. Neither of them spoke at first. Ronan closed the door softly behind her, and they stood together in the dim corridor, the silence between them heavy with everything neither quite knew how to say. "I don't have words for what I just saw," Ronan said finally, his voice rough in a way Elena had not heard from him before, all the careful control of a king momentarily stripped away, leaving only a father who had just witnessed something he had stopped believing was possible. "He had a nightmare," Elena explained gently. "I think whatever fear was chasing him in that dream finally became too much for him to carry alone. I didn't ask him to come to me. He chose it, on his own, when he needed comfort more than he needed distance." 4 months, Ronan repeated, the same phrase he had said to her before, though this time it carried a different weight, something closer to disbelief, mixed with overwhelming gratitude. 4 months of healers, of counsel pressure, of watching my son fade a little more every single day, and it took you 2 weeks to reach something I could not reach in all that time. "It wasn't about reaching him faster," Elena said carefully, not wanting him to carry any misplaced guilt over something that had never been his fault. "You're his father. That comes with expectations, both his and your own, that make patience harder to hold on to. I had no history with him, no weight of loss between us. Sometimes that makes it easier for a frightened creature to trust a stranger before they can trust the people closest to them, not because those people failed, but because the stranger carries none of the same grief." Ronan studied her for a long moment in the dim hallway light, something shifting behind his eyes that Elena could not fully name, though it left a warmth low in her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. "You have a way of making difficult truths sound gentle," he said quietly. "I am not certain I deserve that kindness, but I am grateful for it regardless." Word of the change spread through the pack house faster than either of them anticipated. By the following morning, whispers had already begun circulating among the staff and council members, some filled with genuine relief, others carrying an undertone of unease that Elena did not yet fully understand. She noticed it first in the careful, assessing glances some of the pack members gave her, as she walked the corridors, the way conversations occasionally quieted when she entered a room. Grace, the sharp-tongued council member who had pressed Ronan so firmly during the earlier meeting, approached Elena directly, on the 3rd day after the incident, finding her in the small courtyard where she had taken to eating her midday meal. "You've done something none of our own healers managed," Grace said without preamble, settling onto the bench across from her with the same directness Elena imagined she brought to every conversation. "I won't pretend I'm not impressed. But I will admit, plainly, that some of us are uneasy about how quickly this has happened, and about what it might mean going forward." "What does it mean, in your view?" Elena asked, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily, unwilling to be intimidated by the bluntness of the question. "It means our king has placed enormous trust in someone with no ties to this pack. No history here, nothing binding you to us beyond his own personal request," Grace said. "Some fear what happens if that trust is misplaced. Others simply struggle with the idea that a human succeeded where trained wolves failed. Pride is a difficult thing to set aside, even in the face of genuine gratitude." Elena considered the words carefully before responding. "I understand the unease," she said finally. "I would probably feel it myself, in your position. All I can offer is that my intentions have never been anything beyond helping a frightened child find his way back to the people who love him. I don't want anything from this pack, beyond what I was already offered, shelter and safety in exchange for trying. If that trust is misplaced, it will be my failure to earn it, not some hidden intention I've carried from the start." Grace studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally offering a short, almost reluctant nod. "We shall see," she said, rising from the bench. "I hope, for the boy's sake and for our king's, that you are exactly what you claim to be." The unease Grace had voiced did not fade entirely in the days that followed, though it existed alongside a growing sense of cautious optimism that Elena could feel spreading through the pack house as reports of the cub's continued progress reached more ears. He began allowing her to sit directly beside him rather than across the room, He began accepting food directly from her hand, rather than waiting for her to step away first. And then, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, came a moment that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. She had been telling him a quiet story about a wounded owl she had once nursed back to health, her voice low and steady in the familiar rhythm he had grown accustomed to, when she noticed something strange happening in her peripheral vision. The cub's small body had begun to shimmer faintly at the edges, a subtle shift in the air around him that she recognized, from things she had heard whispered around the pack house, as the earliest signs of a shift beginning. She stopped speaking immediately, holding perfectly still, watching as the shimmer intensified and then, just as quickly, faded away entirely, leaving the cub exactly as he had been before, silver and black fur, amber eyes, small trembling frame. He had tried. For the first time in 4 months, his body had attempted to shift back into his human form, and though it had not succeeded, the attempt itself felt like an earthquake of significance after months of complete stillness. "That's all right," Elena said softly, keeping her voice as calm and steady as she could manage, despite the pounding of her own heart. "That was wonderful. You don't have to try again today if you don't want to. That was already so brave." The cub watched her with wide, uncertain eyes, as though gauging her reaction, searching for any sign of disappointment or pressure in her response. Finding none, something in his posture eased slightly, and he shuffled closer, resting his head against her knee, in a gesture of trust that had become, over these past weeks, increasingly familiar between them. When Elena reported the attempted shift to Ronan that evening, she watched him grip the edge of his desk so tightly, his knuckles turned pale, his composure cracking in a way she had come to recognize as the closest he ever came to open emotion in front of others. "He tried," Ronan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After 4 months, he actually tried." "It didn't work," Elena reminded him gently, though there was no discouragement in her tone, only careful honesty. "But trying at all means something has shifted inside him. I think he's starting to believe, in whatever small way a frightened child can believe such things, that the world might be safe enough to return to." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his desk without truly seeing it, before finally lifting his gaze to meet hers directly. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've given him," he said, "for what you've given both of us. I have spent 4 months believing I had already lost the most important pieces of my life. You have shown me that perhaps I haven't lost everything after all." Something passed between them in that moment, quiet and unspoken, a recognition neither was quite ready to name aloud, though Elena felt it settle in her chest with a warmth that lingered long after she had returned to her own quarters that night. She told herself it was simply the satisfaction of watching progress unfold after weeks of careful, patient work. But lying awake later, staring at the familiar ceiling above her, she found herself thinking not only of the small cub who had rested his head against her knee, but of the tired, grieving king who had looked at her as though she had given him back a piece of hope he thought was gone forever. She did not yet know that the fragile peace they had built, one small step at a time, was about to be tested by a danger that had never truly left their borders, waiting patiently in the shadows for the right moment to strike again. The warning came in the middle of the night, carried by a border scout whose face was pale with urgency as he burst into the council hall demanding to see the king immediately. Ronan was pulled from a rare, dreamless sleep to find Owen waiting outside his chambers, already dressed, his expression grim, in a way that told Ronan the news would not be gentle. "Movement along the eastern ridge," Owen reported as they walked quickly toward the hall. "Unmarked wolves, at least a dozen, moving in formation rather than scattered. The scout recognized one of them from the attack 4 months ago." "He's certain of it." Ronan's blood ran cold. The attack that had taken his mate and broken his son had never been fully explained, the wolves responsible melting back into the shadows before anyone could identify their pack or their purpose. He had spent 4 months increasing patrols, strengthening borders, waiting for the other strike he knew, in his bones, would eventually come. Apparently, that waiting was over. The council hall was already filling with pack leaders and warriors by the time Ronan arrived, the air thick with tension and barely contained fear. Grace stood near the front, her usual sharpness replaced by something harder, more focused, the look of a woman preparing for exactly the kind of crisis she had spent her career anticipating. "What do we know?" Ronan demanded, taking his place at the head of the room, Not enough, Grace admitted. But the pattern matches what little we gathered after the first attack. We believe this is the work of Victor Cole, a rogue pack leader, who has been expanding his territory through violence for the better part of 2 years. We suspected his involvement before, but never had proof. If he is moving on us again, it likely means he sees an opportunity, perhaps believing we are still weakened from the last strike. The word weakened settled uncomfortably in Ronan's chest. He thought immediately of his son, still fragile despite the recent progress, still vulnerable in ways that made him an easy target if Victor Cole's forces breached their borders again. He thought of Elena, who had no training in defense, no experience with the violence that pack politics could bring, caught now in the middle of a danger she had never asked to be part of. "Double every patrol," Ronan ordered, his voice hardening into the tone of a commander rather than a grieving father. "I want warriors stationed at every entrance to the royal den by dawn. Nobody enters or leaves without clearance, and that includes the guest quarters." Owen nodded and began issuing the necessary commands, warriors dispersing quickly to their posts, the pack house transforming within the hour from a place of quiet healing into something closer to a fortress bracing for siege. Ronan remained in the council hall long after the immediate preparations were underway, staring at old maps of the territory, tracing the eastern ridge with his finger, trying to anticipate where the strike might come from this time. It was Elena who finally found him there, well past midnight, drawn from her own restless sleep by the unmistakable sounds of increased activity throughout the pack house. She had thrown a cloak over her nightclothes and made her way through corridors filled with armed warriors, their tense expressions telling her immediately that something significant had shifted. "What's happening?" she asked, stepping into the council hall where Ronan still stood alone over his maps. He looked up, and for a moment, something in his expression softened, despite the weight of the crisis pressing down on him. "The same forces that attacked us 4 months ago have been spotted along our eastern border," he said plainly, seeing no reason to shield her from a truth that concerned her safety directly. "We believe they may be preparing to strike again." Elena's stomach twisted with a fear that had nothing to do with her own safety, and everything to do with the small cub sleeping down the hallway, finally beginning to trust the world around him after months of careful, patient work. "And the boy," she said quietly, "is he in danger?" "Everyone in this pack house is in danger if they breach our borders," Ronan admitted. "But my son, given his current state, given how fragile his progress still is, concerns me more than anyone else. I cannot protect him and lead my warriors at the same time, not the way this situation may demand." "Then let me help," Elena said immediately, the words leaving her before she had fully considered what she was offering. "I know I have no training, no experience with fighting, but I can stay with him. I can keep him calm, keep him from panicking if the worst happens, while you and your warriors handle whatever comes." Ronan studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the offer against the danger it might place her in. "If Victor Cole's forces breach our defenses, that room will not be safe," he said carefully. "I would be asking you to remain in danger alongside him, rather than removing you to somewhere protected." "I'm not leaving him," Elena said, her voice firm despite the fear tightening in her chest. "Not after everything these past weeks have built. If he wakes to chaos and I'm not there, all of that progress could shatter in a single night. I won't let that happen if I can help it." Something in Ronan's expression shifted then, gratitude mixing with a reluctant admiration he did not fully bother hiding. "Then I will have warriors stationed directly outside his door," he said. "You will not be alone in this, even if I cannot be there myself every moment." The following days passed in a state of tense, watchful preparation. Patrols reported continued movement along the border, though no direct strike came, the unmarked wolves seeming content, for now, to simply make their presence known, a silent threat hanging over the territory, like a storm that had not yet broken. Ronan spent most of his waking hours coordinating with his warriors, strategizing defensive positions, sending messengers to allied packs requesting support should the situation escalate further. Elena, meanwhile, maintained her daily visits to the cub's room with as much normalcy as she could manage, though the increased tension throughout the pack house was impossible to fully hide, and she noticed the boy growing more restless, more attuned to the shift in atmosphere around him, as though some instinctive part of him sensed the danger gathering beyond the walls. "It's all right," she told him during one particularly tense afternoon, sitting close enough now that he had taken to resting against her side for much of each visit. Whatever is happening outside this room, you are safe here. I promise you that." She was not entirely certain the promise was one she could keep, but she offered it anyway, understanding instinctively that a frightened creature needed reassurance more than uncertain honesty in moments like these. The cub pressed closer against her, and Elena wrapped an arm carefully around him, something she had not done before, testing whether this new level of contact would be welcome. He did not pull away. Instead, he settled more fully against her, and for the first time since the crisis began, Elena felt a small measure of the same fragile peace they had built together over these past weeks. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Ronan found them, having slipped away from an exhausting round of defensive planning to check on his son in person, something he tried to do daily despite the demands on his time. He paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of Elena and the cub settled together, and something in his tired features eased at the picture they made. "May I come in?" he asked softly, a request he had learned to make every single time, never assuming his presence would be welcomed even now, weeks into their progress. The cub's ears perked slightly at his father's voice, and though he did not immediately move toward him, he did not retreat either, watching Ronan with an attention that felt different from the wary fear of months past. Ronan lowered himself carefully to the floor, a respectful distance away, and for a long moment, the three of them simply sat together in comfortable silence, the tension of the gathering threat outside momentarily forgotten in the quiet warmth of the room. "The council believes Cole is testing our defenses," Ronan said eventually, keeping his voice low, mindful of not disturbing the fragile calm settled over his son. "Gathering information before committing to a full strike. It buys us time, but not much of it." "What happens if they do strike?" Elena asked quietly, careful not to let alarm creep into her tone, aware of how attuned the cub had become to shifts in the emotions around him. "Then we fight," Ronan said simply, "and we protect what matters most. I have faced Cole's forces before, when they first attacked. I do not intend to lose to them again." Elena wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the full scope of the danger they faced, but something in the tired determination of Ronan's expression told her this was not the moment for a longer conversation, not with his son settled so peacefully between them. Instead, she simply nodded, offering silent support in place of the questions she held back, and watched as Ronan reached out, slowly, carefully, and rested his hand gently on his son's back for the first time, in what she suspected had been many long months. The cub did not flinch away. He allowed the touch, brief and tentative as it was, and something passed across Ronan's face in that moment, raw and unguarded, grief and hope tangled together in a way words could never fully capture. Elena looked away, giving him the privacy of that moment, though her own eyes had grown suspiciously warm as well, aware that she was witnessing something profoundly important, a family beginning, however cautiously, to find its way back to each other, even as danger gathered just beyond their borders, waiting for the moment to strike. The strike came on a moonless night, exactly 1 week after the first sighting along the eastern ridge. Warning horns tore through the silence, just past midnight, their deep, urgent calls sending every warrior in the pack house scrambling toward their defensive positions. Elena woke instantly, her heart pounding, and rushed down the hallway to find the guards already stationed outside the cub's door exactly as promised, tense but steady, awaiting further orders. Inside the room, the cub had woken as well, startled from sleep by the horns, his small body trembling with a fear that Elena recognized immediately as more than simple confusion. She rushed to his side, gathering him carefully against her, murmuring the same steady reassurances she had offered him countless times before, though her own pulse hammered with an urgency she worked hard to keep from her voice. "I'm here," she whispered against his fur. "Whatever is happening, I'm not leaving you. You're safe with me." Outside, the sounds of the pack mobilizing grew louder, shouted commands and the heavy footfalls of warriors moving toward the borders, and beneath it all, a distant, rising sound that made Elena's blood run cold, the unmistakable clamor of conflict beginning somewhere beyond the walls. She held the cub closer, positioning herself between him and the door, though she knew, with painful clarity, that her presence alone would offer little true protection if the fighting reached this far into the pack house. Ronan had left hours earlier to coordinate the front line, and Elena found herself praying, in whatever quiet way she still remembered how, that he would return to them safely, that whatever violence unfolded beyond these walls would end swiftly. Without claiming anyone else, this family had already lost too much. Time moved strangely during those tense hours, minutes stretching into what felt like an eternity, the sounds of conflict rising and falling in waves that Elena tried desperately not to interpret, not wanting to guess at what each shift in noise might mean. The cub pressed himself against her the entire time, and Elena kept up a steady, quiet stream of reassurance, telling him stories, humming soft, tuneless melodies, anything to keep both of them anchored against the fear pressing in from every direction. It was nearing dawn when the sounds outside finally began to quiet, the shouts and clashes fading into something calmer, more controlled, though Elena did not dare let herself hope until she heard familiar, purposeful footsteps approaching the door. Footsteps she had come to recognize over these past weeks, even through the fog of her own exhausted fear. The door opened, and Ronan stood there, weary and marked by the night's conflict but whole, alive, his eyes finding Elena and his son immediately, relief washing visibly over his tired features. "It's over," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Cole's forces retreated before dawn. We held the border. Nobody breached the pack house." Elena felt the tension that had gripped her for hours finally release, a shaky breath escaping her as the cub, sensing the shift in the room, lifted his head to look between his father and Elena with wide, uncertain eyes. Ronan crossed the room and lowered himself carefully beside them, and for a long moment, none of them spoke, simply grateful to have made it through the night whole. "We captured 2 of Cole's scouts during the retreat," Ronan said eventually, once his breathing had steadied. "They've already begun revealing what we need to know about his remaining forces and his intentions. The Council believes this defeat will set him back significantly, perhaps for good. Allied packs have already offered support in pursuing him further, to ensure he cannot threaten our borders again." "Then it's truly finished," Elena said quietly, still holding the trembling cub against her side, though his tremors were beginning to ease as the calm in the room settled more fully around them. "For now," Ronan said carefully, unwilling to make promises about a danger as unpredictable as Victor Cole had proven to be, though something in his tired expression suggested a cautious, hard-won optimism. "For now, we are safe. That is more than I dared hope for a week ago." In the days that followed the attack, something remarkable began unfolding within the quiet walls of the royal den. Whether it was the shared fear of that dangerous night, or simply the natural culmination of weeks of patient, careful progress, the cub began changing in ways that left even Elena astonished. He grew bolder in his movements, more willing to explore beyond his small room, following Elena through the pack house corridors with a curiosity that had been entirely absent months before. He began approaching Ronan directly, resting against him during quiet evenings, the way he had once only rested against Elena, allowing his father back into a closeness that grief had stolen from them both. Then, nearly a month after that dangerous night, during a quiet afternoon in the small courtyard where wildflowers had begun blooming along the stone walls, the cub attempted the shift once more. This time, the shimmer at his edges did not fade away. It grew steadily brighter, more defined, until the small silver and black form dissolved entirely, replaced by a thin, trembling boy, with dark hair and amber eyes, so like his mother's, that Elena felt her breath catch in her throat at the sight of him. He knelt there in the grass, human for the first time in 5 months, blinking up at Elena with an expression caught between wonder and overwhelming fear, as though uncertain whether this new vulnerability, this return to a form he had abandoned in his grief, was safe to embrace. "You did it," Elena breathed, tears gathering freely now, no longer something she bothered trying to hide. "You did it. You're all right. You're safe." The boy's lips trembled, and for a long, suspended moment, Elena feared he might retreat again, might shift back into the safer, more familiar wolf form that had protected him for so long. But instead, in a voice rough and unused from months of silence, cracked and uncertain but undeniably real, he spoke his first words since the night his mother died. "Stay," he whispered. "Please stay." Elena gathered him into her arms without hesitation, and he clung to her, small and shaking, finally allowing himself the full comfort of human contact he had denied himself for so long. When Ronan arrived moments later, drawn by a runner who had witnessed the shift and rushed immediately to inform him, he found his son held safely in Elena's arms. Human, speaking, alive in every sense that mattered. Ronan fell to his knees in the grass beside them, and for the first time since his wife's death, the Alpha King allowed himself to weep openly, gathering both his son and Elena into an embrace that held 5 months of grief, fear, and finally, overwhelming relief. "I don't have a name for you," the boy said, later that evening, once the initial overwhelming emotion of the day had settled into something calmer, the three of them sharing a quiet meal together in Ronan's private study for the first time. He looked at Elena with the same careful uncertainty he had carried throughout their weeks together, though something new lived in his expression now, something warm and trusting that had not been there before. "You're not quite like my mother was, but you're not just a stranger either. What should I call you?" Elena's heart swelled at the question, and she considered it carefully, understanding the weight this small decision carried, for a boy who had lost so much, and was only now beginning to rebuild what remained. "Whatever feels right to you," she said gently. "There's no wrong answer." The boy thought about this for a long moment, glancing between Elena and his father, before finally settling on something that made both adults' eyes grow warm with emotion. "Nara," he said softly, testing the word. "It means something between mother and friend, in the old language. That's what you are to me." In the weeks that followed, the pack house that had once echoed with silence and grief slowly filled with new sounds, a boy's laughter, returning gradually to corridors that had missed it desperately, the quiet, steady presence of a woman who had arrived as a stranger and stayed to become something far more essential to the family she had helped heal. Ronan, who had spent 5 months believing he had already lost everything that mattered, found himself falling gradually and completely for the woman who had given him back his son, and one quiet evening, beneath the same stars that had witnessed so much grief and so much healing, he finally allowed himself to speak the feelings he had carried silently for weeks. Elena, who had arrived in this territory with nothing but a worn bag and a gift she had never fully understood the depth of, found in that moment everything she had not realized she was searching for during her long, lonely journey away from a life that no longer fit. A boy who called her Nara, a king who looked at her as though she were the answer to a question he had stopped believing could be answered, a family, reforged slowly and patiently from grief into something whole again. The pack that had once whispered uncertainly about the human woman who had wandered too far into their territory, now spoke of her differently, with respect and gratitude that had been earned through weeks of quiet, unwavering patience. Grace herself, the sharp-tongued council member who had questioned Elena's intentions so directly, became one of her staunchest allies, admitting openly that she had never been happier to be proven wrong. And in the royal den, where a small wounded cub had once let no one near for 4 months, a boy now ran freely through sunlit corridors, laughing, speaking, alive in every way that mattered, held safely within the family that love, patience, and quiet, unwavering kindness had built back from the ashes of unbearable loss.